find out why Harry Houdini was an early champion of Mother's Day and just what sort of supernatural power spiritualism holds from journalist and paranormal expert Aaron Sagers on this episode of Ripley's After Dark. But first, I'm gonna manifest you giving us a like or a thumbs up, and if you haven't already, a sub or a follow. It was June 17th, 1913, and magician, actor, aviator, a man of many talents, Harry Houdini, was having a press conference in Copenhagen when he was handed a telegram. His mother, Cecilia, whom he always had a very strong bond with, had a stroke. A 30-year-old Houdini canceled all of his upcoming performances to get back to his mother in America as soon as he possibly could, but sadly, it was too late. Cecilia had passed and no trick in the book could bring her back. So Aaron, there's a lot of myth and mystery kind of to unpack here with Houdini's story. A lot of biographical information has been embellished over time for storytelling purposes. How much truth is there to that almost Norman Bates level of motherly love, from his mom dressing him to him absolutely adoring her to a different level?
Well, like when you're looking at lore versus fact, there's a little from column A and a little from column B. Yeah, okay, so he was a self-professed mama's boy, and she did provide some counsel on what he would wear during his performances. And indeed, he referred to her as one of his two sweethearts, including his wife, Bess. Okay. And she was, in his mind, his mother was an angel that walked on the earth. But it also kind of makes sense because, look, we've all heard the stereotypes of the Jewish mother, and that actually is kind of part of this. They were very close. She was very protective. And I think,
there was cuddling involved.
Okay. So yeah, there were, stories of him when he was anxious. He would basically crawl up in her lap or cuddle pretty closely, and he would find that to be soothing. And and sadly, after her death, he was so racked with guilt that this lasted at least 16 months in a very deep, dark place. He kind of took off to Europe for a vacation with his wife for 6 weeks or whatever. But,
right.
He wrote to his brother about how depressed he was, about how racked with grief he was. And he would, go to her grave frequently. He would also say the Jewish Kaddish morning prayer for, I guess, about a year, 365 days of this. So he was devastated after her death.
Which makes sense, and it also wasn't the first parental passing that he had dealt with. His father, years prior.
Yeah, when he was 18 years old, his father, who was a rabbi when they first came over to the U.S., he passed away, I believe, from a stroke. And actually, that's kind of, we see sort of the origins of Houdini's later fascination with spiritualism and seances here, because he and his wife went to a medium and they paid for it with his watch.
Oh, wow.
And Houdini, at 18 years old, pretty much figures out that this guy was a fraud and they were being taken for a ride. So you can see how that plays out later.
Yeah, there's a bit of foreshadowing here, but needless to say, his mother's death took a huge toll on Houdini. Audiences began to see Houdini's acts take a turn towards the extreme and almost reckless, from burying himself alive to nearly drowning. Soon after, they witnessed a staunch crusade against spiritualism, mediums, and psychics, or as Houdini called them, vultures who prey on the bereaved. Aaron, before we dive into why he took this stance, I find this interesting because, Houdini's early acts, as he was a struggling magician, he faked seances in those performances. It was a way to pay the bills, a way to get by.
Sure.
What sort of deceptive techniques was he using that might have been able to be like a cue as to, some of those other tricks?
Well, before I get into that, I think it is worth mentioning that, again, this was a guy that post-Civil War, Houdini had seen spiritualism at play. He was at seances as young as 11 years old. He would go as a teen, and he would also start to figure out how these tricks were done. So when it came to his stage show, one thing he would do is with his wife Bess, they would perform as the Houdinis, and they would have a code between one another to sort of establish this spirit communication, in quotes.
Right.
Another thing he would do is get locked into a cabinet. He would be bound, and in this cabinet would be various instruments. And the door would close or the lights would go out, and as there was spirit communication taking place, the audience would hear these instruments going off, but lo and behold, he is still bound. How did he do that?
I don't know.
Whoa. But the coolest thing to me is that Houdini was also a bit of a detective, a psychic detective, if you will.
Okay.
He would roll through town on these medicine shows or whatever, and he would visit a local graveyard. He would listen to local gossip. He might even hire someone as an informant on the ground to kind of loop him in on the various dirt that's happening and who has passed away. Now, you can imagine that might be helpful because when he goes and performs that show that night, he has all this information.
It's super sneaky. It's today's Facebook lurking or Instagram stalking for sure.
I guess so, yeah. He was a bit of a like a social media stalker before his time.
Love it.
You know, or maybe a journalist, if I may.
Okay, fine. That's a little more fair.
So, yeah, I mean, then these shows would happen, and he would have all this intel to draw from. But Houdini was so good at what we call cold reading that even if he didn't prep that night, he could still ask people questions and draw generalized information and make it seem that he was actually having some sort of mediumship abilities. People would buy into it.
I mean, it's that showmanship that we all know Houdini for now.
Yeah, and the guy, even though he wasn't necessarily formally educated, he was a very intelligent man, and later on he would boast about the size of his library. So you would figure that this guy, he just had a quick wit and insight into people.
So, grieving, he wanted to believe in spiritualism, but knew the tricks of the trade, and he wasn't easily fooled. Houdini's campaign against spiritualism spurred from a very unlikely friendship, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, author of the Sherlock Holmes series. In the wake of his son's death during the Great War, Doyle had become a believer in life after death and a missionary of spiritualism, a religion that believes in spirit communication. I also read that Doyle actually believed that Houdini had supernatural powers. He cited the trick that Houdini did. Really simple trick. Most people could probably do it if they've gone to a magic shop once or twice. Pretending to remove your thumb, right? That was the tipping point where he's like, yeah, this dude's paranormal.
I mean, you say that, I can't really do it very well, but
practicing.
Yeah. But I mean, it's kind of like a great gimmick, right? Conan Doyle saying the reason you can't disprove mediums on stage is because your own supernatural power is thus that you're actually blocking their own abilities. That is like such a great line.
I love it.
Yeah.
It checks out.
Yeah, and who knows, maybe there was something to that. I mean, Houdini, as we've said, was incredibly insightful and could read people. So maybe there was something more going on with that.
You want to believe. Houdini wanted to believe. He was a seeker of truth.
He wanted to believe, and even though he did wage this ghost war against spiritualists, he had a belief in the afterlife. He did think that when he passed, he would be reunited with his mother, and he maintained a spiritual Jewish faith. So that came from an authentic place.
Interesting. Well, this friendship took Houdini to an interesting place and a possibility to actually meet his mother. In 1922, Doyle suggested Houdini join him in trying to contact his mother, Cecilia. Houdini accepted, and one Sunday afternoon in June, met Doyle and his wife, Jean, a self-proclaimed medium, at the Ambassador Hotel in Atlantic City. In the seance, Jean delivered pages upon pages of handwritten messages from Cecilia from what they call automatic writing. One read, "Thank God, it last came through," but Houdini, he wasn't buying it. His mother couldn't write English, let alone speak it from the other side. She spoke Yiddish. Additionally, at the top of each page, there was a cross. She also managed to say, "Merry Christmas." We established that she was Jewish. Cecilia was the wife of a rabbi, devoutly Jewish. This simply just didn't make sense at all. And lastly, the seance was on her birthday, which Never came up, did it?
I mean, this is so bad. It's
is.
just like
It
so
is.
bad. And I can just imagine Houdini's reaction of like, Lady Doyle, art, thanks, cool. Just sort of funny about the fact that my mom never spoke English, didn't mention that this is her birthday, and that this coincides with Houdini speaking to the New York Times shortly around this time, sort of kicking off his ghost war in a very public way. He had already been looking into seances, but this was the beginning of 4 years of him very publicly going after mediums.
Wow.
So this friendship
started it all.
It turned into a frenemyship.
Wow. Well, I mean, Doyle left thinking Houdini was changed. Super into it. Houdini thought otherwise. Doyle became defensive, explaining that the rules of our earthly world, they don't apply to the other side, and perhaps Houdini's mother learned English in heaven or something. The Doyles walked away, feeling that Houdini was deeply moved by the experience, publicly proclaiming that Houdini was a spiritualist believer. That's where you went wrong. Houdini, he completely felt otherwise. So Houdini replied to the press that spiritualism was a sham and that its practitioners were just total fraudsters. A feud developed between the two celebrities, obviously, and Doyle wrote that Houdini was a very conceited and self-opinionated man. Houdini retaliated by writing, "Doyle is a bit senile and easily bamboozled." Great word, bamboozled right there. All right. Doyle, he's a medical doctor. He developed one of the most rational and pragmatic characters in literature, Sherlock Holmes. He seems like a totally unlikely guy to get kind of wrapped up in spiritualism. Like, what gives?
I mean, I do think that it is because of all of the loss of life that he had experienced close to him. And it really kind of tracked with, during World War I, the big explosion, the second wave, if you will, of spiritualism. People experiencing a lot of death in their lives. So they sought answers. So that made sense to me. But as they're having this war of words across newspapers and whatnot, something that did kind of get lost in this is that Houdini said these pretty cold stuff, but he also said spiritualism is kind of a beautiful thing when practiced honestly and authentically. He mainly took issue with psychics and mediums that were accepting money and manipulating, profiting off of people who were mourning, who were full of grief.
Which makes sense. It seems like they could have had some sort of misunderstanding, but there was something missing in that communication, right? Houdini used his platform to publicly denounce spiritualism, and he was on a mission. During his tours, shows, and personal appearances to promote his films, he projected visual presentations, pretty much PowerPoint before PowerPoint, breaking down how he believed mediums were using trickery disguised as mystical gifts. He'd even attend seances undercover. Once he gathered what he felt was sufficient evidence of fraud, he would then leap up and throw off a disguise, straight up disguise. I'm sure it's not like the mustache glasses situation, but still, surprise, it's Houdini. I don't think that's his voice either, it's just what I know.
It was me all along. I don't know.
He actually even joined a committee formed by Scientific American magazine, offering a reward to anyone that could demonstrate paranormal powers that were proved to be authentic. Was anything ever deemed truly paranormal with this?
Well, no, because he was on such a rampage after the Conan Doyle seance. Like, even though he had started this ghost war, again, ghost war, I love it, I'm working it in all the time. You know, he was on this rampage, and he even had agents out there in the field going to seances when he couldn't do that.
These are ghost war soldiers, okay?
Ghost war soldiers. But because they were approaching this from the mission of debunking this, even if they were to witness something perhaps truly unexplainable or even maybe paranormal, I don't know that they would have been open-minded enough to accept it.
Ironically, following Houdini's death on Halloween 1926, Bess, his wife, began holding annual seances to contact him. She was quoted as taking up the magician's wand laid down by her husband's dying hand. She and Houdini had agreed on a secret code that he would communicate to her after his death. These Halloween seances went on for 10 years, but no medium ever cracked the secret code. Maybe once.
Yeah, and this is where the lore and the facts, even at that time, were overlapping, because there was this one guy named Ford who had convinced Bess Houdini that he had maybe established contact with Cecilia, Houdini's mom, and then later Houdini himself, using the code that was agreed upon between Houdini and Bess. But there was so much conflict, like these two warring factions of skeptics and believers made it such that you didn't know who to believe. And even this many years later, almost 100 years after Houdini's death, we don't know if the facts are really lining up or not. Maybe Houdini did come through. Maybe he did come through in this seance with Ford.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty tragic and unexpected death.
Exactly.
Someone punched him in the stomach. He wasn't prepared.
No.
And that's just 2 days later, passed away.
But, I mean, think of the tragedy of this, that if she had established contact with him, which she initially said she had, and then recanted, so there's a lot of back and forth still.
Yeah.
If he had come through, if he had managed to open that door from the other side and make himself known to Bess, the fact that the magicians weren't willing to believe, and the fact that she was even recanted this experience, it's almost like the magician's greatest trick went unnoticed.
Wow. After Houdini's death, Doyle wrote Bess a letter of condolence, although it was pretty unrelenting. It wrote, "I'm sure that with strength of character and possibly his desire to make reparation, he will come back." As a gesture of gratitude, Bess then sent a portfolio of artwork by Doyle's own father that Houdini acquired at auction. Doyle accepted the surprising gift as a peace offering, and the feud was finally settled from beyond the grave. Aaron, before we kind of end this episode, I just have to ask, and I have to kind of push the needle for Ripley's a little bit here, right? Everything we do is fact-based. You know, there's lore and trickery and everything we've learned today, but this is After Dark. In your personal experience, can you confidently say that you have seen paranormal power?
This is not a yes/no response, Sabrina. You're put me on the spot. I'm not falling for it. Because, look, the paranormal means things that are not currently defined by science. And science is an evolving field. It's constantly asking questions and even redefining the things that we think we know. Now, with regards to me, I have experienced things that I would put in the unexplained category, but would I say they're paranormal? I'm hedging my bets here, because I will say I can't say it's not paranormal, but I cannot say with 100% certainty that it is paranormal. It's truly strange, and I've seen things that continue to be a mystery to me and encourage me to continue that pursuit.
I love that. Well, thank you, Aaron, for joining us today and sharing our spooky and spiritual wealth of knowledge with us. Until next time, I'm Sabrina Seek, and happy Mother's Day from Ripley's Believe It or Not.